This really is an emergency, and I think we have to begin to kind of treat it as such. It's absolutely the greatest threat that humanity has ever faced. And I don't think it's hyperbole or it's alarmist, it's just simply true. Humanity and most species on the planet are at the risk of becoming extinct. The climate emergency, really, when we look at it, what it does is it exposes the complete dead end that the capitalist system has driven us towards. This is a system that must pursue profit at all costs, even if it means guaranteeing extinction. And now it is the leading scientists of their system that are exposing the complete catastrophe that this system is. Those of us who are alive today are faced with a special challenge, whether we accept it or not. I think that our lives will be measured by whether we can rid humanity of this disaster and of this system once and for all. It's really true that we have everything to lose and a world to win. And so to begin, the main issue is that greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise. No real sign of slowing down. CO2 increased to its highest point last year, and it continues to increase year after year. And what that means is that every single thing we have done until now has failed. It's not sufficient, nowhere near. It's allowed for the problem to persist. And so I want to try and focus on why. Why is that? But before, what we see is as the greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise, we have a continuation of global temperature increases. So the last 5 years have been the hottest 5 years on record ever, and if we were doing this presentation 5 years ago, I could say the last 5 years were the hottest 5 years on record. July 2019 was the hottest month ever recorded. And many people have discussed the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC report in 2018. It was an attempt to give a kind of warning to the world about how severe this problem is. It talks about how we absolutely need to do everything we can to reduce the total quantity of global temperature increase, and it talks about what it would take to reduce it, to keep it at only a 1.5 degree increase of Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. And basically, it would mean that greenhouse gas emissions would have to reach zero by 2050 in order to achieve a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase only, and 2075 to achieve a 2 degrees Celsius. But the point is that the difference between these absolutely climate catastrophe is still expected in either scenario. The difference is about our chances of survival. 1.5 degrees would mean, only 70 to 90% of coral reefs would die, whereas 2 degrees Celsius would mean 100% of coral reefs die. A 2 degrees Celsius rise would mean species extinction would be 3 times as worse than it already is. It would mean glacier melt would be 10 times as worse, and temperature increases would be 3 times as worse. Overall, the difference really is whether we can perhaps survive or not. And in addition, we're not even coming close to meeting either of these targets. We're on pace right now to produce a global temperature rise of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. This would mean an absolute guaranteed destruction of most life on the planet, including humanity. And this report that was released is really among the more conservative estimates. We're already seeing many of the impacts that the report links to a 1.5 degree rise. We're already seeing them now. What that means is the climate catastrophe, in fact, it's already upon us. So absolutely we see it in terms of extreme weather events around the world. Larger and more frequent typhoons and monsoons and hurricanes. The highest category of hurricane is 5. It means winds that have 157 miles per hour or higher. But we're already seeing hurricanes over 185, over 200 miles per hour that some climate scientists want to introduce a category 6 because it doesn't make any sense when you have that much of a variation in one of these. What it means is we're likely looking at hurricanes as powerful as those in Puerto Rico, in the Bahamas, or in Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans every single year in the United States or more in the surrounding areas. Obviously, it means something closer to home. As global temperatures increase, it means you have higher temperatures, more droughts, increased risk of fires. So much so that basically in California we have now a year-round fire season. And of course we have to mention the over 7 million of acres of forest that have burned in the Amazon. every single measurement that scientists have predicted, it turns out to be worse. It's sort of as if there should be a little attachment to every prediction, which is it's worse than predicted every single time. So when we look at glacier melt, it's faster than it was predicted. The Antarctic ice sheet has increased sixfold between 1979 and 2017. And total glacier mass loss for 2015 to 2019 is the hottest on any 5-year record. Well, that shouldn't be surprising, given those are the hottest temperatures ever recorded. But some of the things that aren't in that report is these potential dangerous feedback loops, like the melting of the permafrost layer. Trapped underneath the permafrost layer is methane, which can be as potent as 86 times more than carbon dioxide in terms of causing global warming. And if this permafrost layer melts, you can set a feedback loop where you have more warming, more permafrost thawing, more methane released, and so on. And this isn't even factored into the IPCC report. Some scientists in MIT are suggesting that if this were to continue, you could see the melting of clouds such that cloud formation couldn't occur, which could even accelerate the rate of temperature increase. At the same time, we're seeing sea level rise, again, worse than expected. And global sea level rise per year has increased around 32% since 2006. And a consequence of all of this is that we're already living in what many scientists call the sixth mass extinction event. So you have a background rate of species extinction, which is like the normal rate that species should go extinct naturally. It's about 5 species per year. Already we're seeing species going extinct at 1,000 times the background rate, which means like a dozen per day. As many as 30 to 50% of all species could be heading towards extinction by mid-century. So to look at some of these, we see it with insects. Insects have a 75% decline in the last 27 years. 12% of all birds are threatened with extinction. You've had 30% fewer birds in the United States and Canada since 1971. 23% of all mammals are threatened with extinction. 40% of amphibians threatened with extinction. The monarch butterfly could go extinct. It has already had a 97% decline since 1980 in North America. It has a 72% chance of being extinct in 20 years. Bees, you have what's called colony collapse disorder. It's a result of climate change, both directly and indirectly. So warmer weather means there's more mites, which attack and feed off of the honeybees. You have climate disruption means shorter growing periods. You have earlier arrivals of flowers, or late arrivals, or shorter arrivals, and it has increased to the death of bees. And the most deadly of all are pesticides, which come from the fossil fuel industry. They come from petrochemicals. And the average bee has about 8 neurotoxins in it, and that's leading to colony collapse. It's so bad that the largest farms in the United States can no longer rely on natural bees. They have to rely on rented bees raised by beekeepers. A couple other ones. This is a moose in New England, where due to ticks, the rise in ticks due to warmer weathers, it's led to a 70% death rate of calves of moose and elk over a 3-year period. And the worst of all, perhaps, is phytoplankton, which is responsible for roughly 50 to 85% of all oxygen. So every single breath you take comes from them for the most part. And due to the ocean's acidity has risen 26% since the beginning of the industrial era. Ocean surface temperatures have been warming steadily since 1970. For the past 25 years, they've been warming twice as fast. And what you see is that the combination of these have led to a decline in plankton by about 40% since 1950. Not only do they supply oxygen, but they absorb carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So if they die off, the result will be even more CO2 into the atmosphere and less oxygen. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say if their rate of decline is too far, it's absolutely guaranteed that humans and most life on the planet will not be able to survive. At the same time, all of these combination of extreme weather has led to a massive crisis of displaced people all over the world. The largest category of refugees are no longer from military conflicts. They're from extreme weather-related events. An average of 20 million climate refugees are produced every single year and growing, and there's absolutely no relief provided by the system of capitalism. For example, in the Philippines last year, an estimated 3.8 million people were displaced, most of whom were due to Typhoon Mangku. In India, an estimated 2 million people were displaced from monsoons alone. And at the same time, you have an estimated 40% of India's population may have no access to drinking water by 2030. That's hundreds of millions of new climate refugees. And we don't have to go all the way across the world to look at this. We see this exact crisis at our southern border, where the majority of the recent migrants are due to climate change. Agricultural migrants in the Guatemalan highlands, where warmer temperatures, drought, and a combination of weather-related factors have led to massive failure of agricultural lands, and you see entire families leaving and coming to the border because they have absolutely no other way to survive. Perhaps in the United States, the first population threatened with sea level rise that will become displaced is off this island of Alaska. It's a small population. They've been appealing to the government for years for some kind of relief. They've been left with nothing. So in a way, we see it's a kind of glimpse of what's to come. People who've been abandoned by this system and forced to fend for themselves. And also, we don't have to look to Alaska. We could look in California, where the fire last year in Paradise displaced roughly 90% of that population, most of whom, 20,000 residents, had to go to Chico, where many of them become homeless because there's not enough jobs, there's not enough housing, and so on. And this is a kind of glimpse of the sort of catastrophes that are waiting for us as this problem emerges and continues. And the problem is that what needs to be done is absolutely clear and is waiting to be done. So what scientists say we need to do is simply reduce greenhouse gas emissions to zero. What that would look like is, as the graph goes up, it needs to stop going up and immediately going down as of yesterday. And this is completely possible, even with the technology we have already in existence, not to speak of what could be produced. We could begin to do this, but it is not being implemented. And so to get a glimpse of this, we can go back to 1980 when ExxonMobil did its own research on climate change in the fossil fuel industry. And what they found was that absolutely without a doubt that the fossil fuel industry is the main culprit leading to greenhouse gas emissions. What they did was bury the report and instead fund climate denial, so-called propaganda research. But in fact, there is no climate denialism. It's just complete nonsense that they've invented in order to continue to do what it is they want to do. What we see is typically the fossil fuel industry is zoomed in on as the main source of this problem. It's true, but it's not simply due to the production of oil and natural gas. So what we see is the global demand for energy is increasing along with the rise of CO2 emissions. And last year, in fact, was a 2.3 increase, the fastest paced increase we've seen in decades. At the same time, the U.S. oil production has been expanding rapidly, and it reached a record high to become the #1 oil producer in the world last year. Much of this growth for the United States is in West Texas, in this area called the Permian Basin, where a shale drilling frenzy is taking place, producing over 4 million barrels a day, which is more than any of the 14 members of OPEC combined, except for Saudi Arabia and Iraq. And U.S. oil production increased by 2 million barrels a day last year. This is the largest one-year increase ever recorded in history of oil production. And this increase we see in oil production has also given the United States new leverage around the globe. So for example, in Iran, the United States has intensified sanctions on Iran, trying to bring Iran's oil exports to zero in order to devastate their economy. Before this new round of sanctions, Iran exported 2.5 million barrels per day, and now, as of July 2019, after the sanctions, it's been reduced to 100,000 barrels per day. And the amount of oil and natural gas that's being produced in this area of West Texas is not even close to reaching its capacity yet. It's just a beginning, and they have every intention of maximizing it. Exxon is already constructing one of the largest oil and gas facilities in the world there, and this means that greenhouse gas emissions that will result from these new investments will only accelerate and increase the level of climate catastrophe. But it's not just oil used for energy. What we look at is the fossil fuel industry is the foundation of the entire capitalist economy. So basically, Fossil fuel is responsible for producing everything on your body right now, everything you're sitting on, probably everything you've interacted with, for the last few hours of the day, just to kind of, it's not really fun, but if you wanted to do this, you could pick anything on this list, and you probably interacted with it, and it comes from the fossil fuel industries, even your water filters. So the fossil fuel industry is attached to basically the entire economic system of the entire global economy. So if we look at clothing, right? So you look at polyester, it comes from the petrochemical industry. You look at acrylic, it depends upon the petrochemical industry. If you stop wearing jeans and you've instead got those yoga pants, the reason that those yoga pants have become more popular than the jeans is because they come from the petrochemical industry, and they are too cheap to make. The profit margin is way greater. When you look at the pharmaceutical industry, it comes from the petrochemical industry. Over 90% of the chemicals that are used to produce the feedstock, to produce pharmaceuticals, comes from the petrochemical industry, precisely because these are fossil fuel refining byproducts. They are cheap. They are so expendable and so usable, you can't compete with them. And that's why the oil companies, all of them, have a chemical side to them. They have a chemical wing of their corporation, and as oil production is increasing, so too is their investments in the chemical industry. We see the United States military. It depends completely on fossil fuels. The U.S. military alone is the world's 55th biggest emitter of CO2. For example, with the invasion of Afghanistan and the ongoing war, since 2001, the U.S. military is estimated to have emitted 1.2 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere. Just for a comparison, the entire annual carbon emissions of the UK is only 360 million tons. So the military depends upon the fossil fuel industry. In addition to the fossil fuel industry, you have greenhouse gas emissions coming from other sections of the economy. So you have cement production, which produces 8% of global CO2 emissions. You have iron and steel, which produce roughly 5% of global emissions, and these are growing every year. Agriculture is responsible for 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. So not only does the production of agriculture, the destruction of various forests and so on, but also the entire agricultural industry depends upon the petrochemical industry. The fertilizers come from the petrochemical industry. The pesticides come from the petrochemical industry. So industrial agriculture, as we know it, cannot exist without the fossil fuel industry. The soil has been so depleted due to this industrial agriculture that some scientists warn there's only 60 years of farming at this way left, right? Well, guess what that means? We should stop. The meat and dairy industry, due to the methane from the cows, is responsible for the equivalent of roughly the top 3 oil companies in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions, and most of them don't even report it. There's not even accurate research on or accurate reporting on how deep their emissions are. And overall, this system is a system of overproduction and waste. So we're not even looking at how much of all this production is going to just crap that is thrown away and accumulating into the wasteland. So you have roughly 50% of all food that is totally edible is destroyed, that is produced. And about 10% of emissions from greenhouse gas emissions come from waste alone. And so what we see is the entire global economy is inseparable from the fossil fuel industry. So the reason we haven't seen the necessary implementation of the solutions is because that would mean the end of their economic system of capitalism. It requires the end of their system, and they have chosen to save capitalism and to destroy the environment as a consequence. For example, the one little year we saw a teeny tiny decline in greenhouse gas emissions was 2009, the peak of the economic crisis. So their decline of overall GDP on the scale of the world due to that crisis was sufficient to decrease greenhouse gas emissions by a whole whopping 1%. But what we need is to decrease it 10 to 15% per year, and all their chief economists say that's not allowed. That would mean economic crisis, and they're not willing to do it. Instead, they're ready to do what they call climate adaptation, to simply continue to see the results of the climate catastrophe and simply adapt, to rebuild where they can make profits, to just allow the displacement to take place. They say, this was a report from 2015, climate change is an urgent and growing threat to our national security, contributing to increased natural disasters, refugee flows, and intensified conflicts over resources. And they're absolutely prepared to engage in those conflicts and to increase the militarization of the border as one way to try to deal with the increased level of displacement. What this means is they are absolutely anticipating further conflict. They're going to extract to the last drop, and really they're ready for a race for what's left. In other words, they are absolutely determined to continue their system at all costs. Obviously, that is not a future that we can accept.